It was a scandal that absolutely rocked Edwardian Ireland. What happened to the Irish crown jewels stolen right from under the British government's nose in Dublin Castle in 1907? How did the theft of these priceless gems go unnoticed for so embarrassingly long? Who were the primary suspects and what might have happened to the jewels? All will be revealed in this week's episode of History Calling. Just before I start, please remember to give this video a like and also to hype it, as that helps to get it in front of other people. You can subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so you never miss my uploads, and join my YouTube membership for bonus material and perks. Even more bonuses are also available by becoming a patron at patreon.com/historycalling, including extra weekly podcasts and early access to ad-free videos. The link is below for you and in the pinned comment. The Irish crown jewels were the insignia of the chivalric Order of St. Patrick, which had been founded in 1783 as a counterpart to the English Order of the Garter and the Scottish Order of the Thistle. Nowadays, I find that this order and the jewels that went with it are mostly forgotten, for when I pulled this topic as a video idea, having mentioned it in another video all about the theft of some of the French crown jewels from the Louvre Museum in October 2025, I had a lot of people tell me that they'd never heard of the Irish crown jewels, but would love to know more. The main jewels were a diamond star and a diamond badge, both worn by the Grand Master of the Order, who was also the Lord Lieutenant or Viceroy of Ireland. That is, the man who handled the day-to-day running of the country on behalf of the British government, though it was largely a ceremonial role by the 20th century. Although I can't show you a colour photograph of the Grand Master's star, because it was stolen and the only colour images we have of it are in paintings, it was actually not much different in form to those worn by regular Knights of the Order, and I do have a picture of one of those. It was later described in a newspaper report about the theft in the Evening Herald as composed of brilliants, Brazilian stones, consisting of points issuing from a centre enclosing a cross of rubies and a trefoil of emeralds and sky blue enamel, with quis separabit MDCCLXXXIII in rose diamonds. The Latin is the order's motto, which means "Who can separate us?" and the Roman numerals were the year 1783. The major difference, in my opinion, between the star that you see here and the Grand Master's star is the materials used. The rays of the star in this photo are clearly not made of diamonds, whereas the Grand Master's star rays were. Likewise, the motto and year here are not picked out in the rose diamonds which were used on the Grand Master's star. The provision of jewels for the order obviously wasn't a great priority, given that it had been in existence for nearly 50 years before they were created, and they owed their existence in part to a desire to use up some slightly tainted jewels in the royal family's collection. The Lost Star was created in 1830 to 1831 by Rundell, Bridge and Rundell Jewellers in London, and was made from 394 diamonds which had once belonged to Queen Charlotte, before being given by her son George IV to his mistress Lady Cunningham. When George died, Lady Cunningham returned the stones to his family, and his brother, William IV, had them used to create the insignia for the Grand Master of the Order of St. Patrick, along with a jewelled badge of the Order of the Bath, which had once belonged to his father, George III. As for the badge of the Order of St. Patrick, it was, quote, set in silver, containing a trefoil and emeralds on a ruby cross, surrounded by a sky blue enamelled circle, with quis separabit MDCCLXXXIII in rose diamonds in a circle of large Brazilian stones, surmounted by a harp in diamonds and a loop. It had once belonged to George IV. Also stolen were 5 collars of the Knights Companion of the Order. These were, quote, composed of gold with roses and harps alternately tied together in knots of gold. The roses were enamelled and there was an imperial jewelled crown surmounting a harp of gold. One of these collars had a badge of the order on it, which was composed of Brazilian stones and the cross of St. Patrick in rubies in blue emerald circle. It also had the order's motto and year of creation in Latin picked out, quote, in rose diamonds, the whole enclosed by a wreath of trefoil in emeralds on a gold ground enamelled in colours. This little collection of jewels was not as dazzling or as historic as either of the collections kept in England or Scotland, but in 1907 they were still valued at £50,000, the equivalent of about 5.2 million today, so not too shabby. They were in the custody of Sir Arthur Vicars, the Ulster King of Arms, who was also the Magistrate and Knight Attendant of the Order of St. Patrick. The jewels were kept in a safe in the ground floor library of the Office of Arms, which was then based in the Bedford Tower of Dublin Castle. They should, of course, have been in a much more secure location, and when the Office of Arms had moved into the Bedford Tower in 1903 from elsewhere in the castle, the original plan was to put the safe in a strong room there. However, it would not fit through the door into that room, and that is why it ended up in the library, with Vicars' consent. In hindsight, he should have acquired a new safe which would fit through the door, but he never bothered, despite the fact that even he had written in a series of statutes authored in 1905, which explained how the jewels should be cared for, that they should be kept in a safe in the strong room. The library was used as a waiting area for anyone visiting the officials working in the tower, so plenty of people would have known that that's where the safe was. The Order's insignia were last seen on the 11th of June 1907, when they were shown by Vicars to John Hodgson, the librarian of the Duke of Northumberland. Then, in early July, there was a series of odd security lapses. On the 3rd of that month, a Mrs. Mary Farrell, who was responsible for cleaning Bedford Tower, discovered when she arrived at work that the front door was unlocked. She reported it to a sentry, who told Vicars, who did nothing. Then, on the 6th of July, Mrs. Farrell found that the outer door to the strong room was open, though the inner grille inside that room was still locked, but with the key hanging in it, which was a normal enough occurrence done for convenience. Again, she reported it. Again, the information was passed up the chain to Vicars. Again, he seemed unperturbed. It was only later that day, when he asked a colleague to place an item in the safe, that the theft was discovered. At a later vice-regal commission held in January 1908, a detailed description of the sequence of events that day was provided. Parts of it were printed in the Times newspaper and read as follows. It was between 12:30 and 1 p.m. on Saturday the 6th of July that Stivvy, that's William Stivvy, the Office of Arms messenger, told Sir Arthur Vicars about the strong room having been found open. About 2:15 p.m. on the same day, Stivvy went to Sir Arthur Vicars' room to inquire whether he might go for the day. Sir Arthur gave him the key of the safe and the box containing the collar of a deceased knight of St. Patrick which had just been returned, and told him to open the safe and place the collar in it. This was the first time that Stivvy ever had the key of the safe in his hand. It seems strange that Stivvy should at any time have been entrusted with the key of the safe, but that he should have been entrusted with it just after the occurrence of incidents which called for peculiar care seems stranger still. Stivvy proceeded to the safe and tried to open it. He found, in the way which is fully described in his evidence, that the safe was actually unlocked. He did not open the safe. Sir Arthur Vicars came downstairs immediately, and Stivvy told him the safe was not locked. Sir Arthur thereupon opened the safe and found that the jewels and all the collars and badges in the safe were gone. The cases which had contained the jewels, collars and badges had all been carefully replaced, but a case containing his mother's diamonds, which was locked and the key of which was in the hands of Mr. George Mahoney, his half-brother, had been removed. The police were then sent for and told what had happened, and even then not a word was said about the strong room having been found open that very morning. When Superintendent Lowe said, "What about the strong room?" Sir Arthur replied, "It is a modern safe, a milliner's safe, and quite secure. It could not be opened except by its own key." Nobody on Saturday the 6th mentioned to the police either that the outer door had been found open on the morning of Wednesday, or that the strong room had been found open on that morning, Saturday. And it was only on Sunday the 7th that Detective Kerr, we'll come back to him in a minute, heard these facts from Mrs. Farrell for the first time. A statement put out by the castle a few days after the theft was discovered added that "there is no mark on the safe to indicate that any violence was used to open it, nor is there any indication to show that access to the building was obtained otherwise than by regular means. When the news broke in the press, it was an absolute sensation, and to make matters worse, a visit from the King and Queen was imminent. Edward VII had been intending to invest Lord Castletown as a new Knight of the Order during his visit, which began just 4 days after the theft was discovered, but that investiture was cancelled and later carried out the following year. As well as the embarrassment for the British officials working at the castle that these treasures had been stolen out from under their noses, the whole situation also stank of an inside job. This was because the general public could not just walk into Bedford Tower. The place had guards. In fact, the castle was actually the headquarters of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, which only added to the humiliation of all who worked there. The Bedford Tower should have been one of the most secure locations in the city. The doors to the strong room and safe had been seen locked the nights before they were discovered open, and no one could ever explain how someone had entered the tower on those 2 nights, the 2nd and 5th of July, without the guard on duty in the castle's upper yard noticing. In addition, as the formal statement noted, there was no evidence of a break-in in the building, and when examined, the locks on the strong room door and the safe itself were not broken, scratched, or otherwise interfered with. Whoever had done this had apparently had keys to the building's outer door, the strong room, and the safe, and the police said in posters about the theft that they suspected the use of a false key on the safe, by which I assume they meant a copy of one of the originals. The locksmiths hired to examine the locks suspected that the original keys had been used though, as there were absolutely no marks on the mechanisms, which a slightly imperfect copy made from a wax impression of the original key would have made. Either the proper keys were used, or absolutely perfect copies were. So who had the necessary keys to begin with? The police ascertained that 7 people had keys to the outside door. Sir Arthur Vicars, Mr. George Burchell, who was Vicar's secretary, Vicar's nephew, Pearson Mahoney, who was also the Cork Herald, William Stivey, Mrs. Farrell, Detective Kerr, who was the man who did the nightly checks of the building, and a man called John O'Keefe, who only worked in the tower during the Dublin social season, which had finished back in March. He hadn't been back since. As for the strong room's outer door, there were 4 keys in the possession of Vicars, Mahoney, and Stivey, while Burchell's key was actually kept inside the strong room itself. The key to the grille inside the strong room was left in an unlocked drawer when no one was in the office, and in the lock itself when someone was there. This was to make it quicker and easier to access materials needed inside the strong room on a day-to-day basis. As for the safe containing the jewels, there were only 2 keys to it, and both were in Arthur Vicars' possession. One he kept on him at all times, the other he kept in a drawer in his home. So whoever committed the crime, and it could have been a conspiracy involving more than one person, needed access to all 3 keys: the outer door of the building, the outer door of the strong room, and the safe. This meant that they probably needed access to Arthur Vicars' home to be able to get at his spare key without him realising it. This made Arthur Vicars, his nephew Pearson Mahoney, who visited his uncle's house regularly, and a man named Francis Shackleton, who was the Dublin Herald, the younger brother of the famous polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, and a man who often stayed with Vicars, the most likely suspects. One other man, Francis Bennett Goldney, who held the position of Athlone Pursuivant, could also possibly have gained access to the keys. We'll look into these men in more detail in a minute, but first I'd like to draw your attention to some of the strangest aspects of this case. The open door to the tower, discovered on the 3rd of July, suggested that the jewels had perhaps been stolen on the night of the 2nd, and that door left open to prompt the discovery that they were missing. When this didn't happen, the thief returned on the night of the 5th and left the door to the strong room open, again in an effort to kickstart an investigation which would reveal the missing jewels. This seeming determination for the crime to be discovered, plus the fact that many items of great value held in the strong room were not taken, suggested that the jewels were a deliberate target, and hinted at a possible political motive, with the theft timed to coincide with the king's imminent visit and create maximum embarrassment and trouble for the Dublin Castle administration. It was all very strange though, for why did the thief even bother to get a key to the strong room when the jewels out in the library were clearly the target all along? No one has ever been able to satisfactorily explain this sequence of events or what the thief was thinking. The best the police could come up with was the idea that there were multiple people involved, and in trying to force the discovery of the missing jewels, one of the perpetrators was trying to ensure that the other or others would have cast iron alibis for the dates that the jewels were supposedly taken. Given that they hadn't been seen since the 11th of June though, this didn't really work out, as there was actually a pretty wide time frame in which they could have gone missing. It's just a guess that they were taken at the start of July. Also, if you wanted to make sure that the theft was discovered, why not just leave the door of the safe open? The other odd thing about this case is that a ribbon, which had been attached to the star on a swivel with little hooks on it, had been carefully removed from the jewel with a screwdriver which the thief must have brought with them. This ribbon was left in the box in the safe, suggesting that the person was in no hurry and was being careful not to rip the fabric. Edward VII was absolutely livid about the whole situation, and his fury was something to behold. One witness to it said that his rage was something terrible and fearful. At first, he would have it that the robbery had been planned as a personal insult, that it was part of a plot to prevent him visiting Ireland, and that it might easily be the prelude to an even more serious crime, an attack on his consort and himself. I am sure the officials he lectured never forgot his words, for His Majesty could be scathingly sarcastic when he wished. No one could placate him, not even the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Earl of Aberdeen. A major investigation was undertaken and a £1,000 reward offered for information, but this was 1907. There were no security cameras, alarms, DNA or useful fingerprints to be found, and there were no witnesses. No one even knew exactly when the crime had been committed. Despite the resources thrown at the problem, the jewels could not be discovered, nor could the perpetrator or perpetrators. In an effort to make some headway in the case, a chief inspector from Scotland Yard called John Keane was brought in the week after the theft was discovered. Despite his investigations, there was no progress, or at least no public progress in the case, and whatever he discovered, he was quickly removed from the case at the start of August, and his reports have subsequently disappeared. Make of that what you will. All we really know is that he firmly believed it was an inside job too. Poor William Stivey, who was never suspected of having done anything more than discover the theft, was dismissed from his office on the 12th of October. Greater blame was quickly laid at Sir Arthur Vicars' door, however, for not taking better care of the jewels in his custody, and indeed it does seem he was lazy in his duties, for the safe was meant to be in the strong room after all, and he'd had 4 years to sort that problem out. By the end of October 1907, he was suspended, and everyone else in the Office of Arms was out of a job, as that office was dissolved and reconstituted in the wake of the scandal. Now, no one really thought Sir Arthur had stolen the jewels, and he's still not a popular suspect to this day. However, we must acknowledge that some of his behaviour in the lead up to the discovery that they were gone seemed unusually incompetent and even odd. First, in May of 1907, the key that he usually kept on his person at all times was attached to another keyring and went out of Vicars' possession briefly until one of his maids noticed what had happened and sent it on to him. He was also known to be very much set in his routine, a fastidious kind of a man who liked everything just so. The fact that he didn't seem more concerned about the open doors discovered on the 3rd and 6th of July seemed odd for that reason, as did his decision to let Stivey go and open the safe on the day the theft was discovered, when the man had never done so in his life. Then again, he was obviously not as fastidious as some claimed if he'd never bothered to have a new safe installed in the strong room for the jewels to go into and had not taken better care of the keys to the safe. As we'll see going forwards, he also had a tendency to be too trusting of those around him, believing that they simply wouldn't do him any harm. Years later, this personality trait would lead him to a horrific end, but more on that later. Also, had he stolen the jewels, unless he'd had them broken up very quickly afterwards, he could have posted them back to the castle anonymously once he realised the destruction the theft was wreaking on his life in an effort at damage control. Yet they never reappeared. Francis Bennett Goldney was not considered a suspect at the time, but after his death, several valuable books, manuscripts and painting were discovered in his possession, which he had taken in his capacity as Mayor of Canterbury, which was another job he held. He later became MP for Canterbury too. He was evidently a thief in my opinion, though a judge involved in the case held to establish ownership of the items said that he thought the man was just negligent about returning things he'd borrowed, otherwise known as being a thief, but he wasn't in Dublin during the window of time that the theft occurred. Did he steal the jewels with the aid of an accomplice though? We'll never know. The most popular suspect then and now was Francis Shackleton. Frank was known to be an overspender who lived beyond his means and who was frequenting pawn shops in the weeks and months after the theft. His financial difficulties were thought to be the motive for the crime, while his position in the Dublin Castle administration, friendship with Vicars and access to his home and knowledge of the best time to take the safe key unnoticed have been cited as his means and opportunity. Now, these particulars don't mean that he was guilty of stealing them, but they certainly made him vulnerable to suspicion, as did the fact that he was gay, which was then illegal. As well as the suspicion that he and Vicars were involved with each other, never proven by the way, he was also an associate of the king's brother-in-law, the Duke of Argyll, husband of Princess Louise, and Argyll's uncle, Lord Ronald Gower. There were rumours that both Argyll and Gower were gay too, and that Shackleton's connection to them and his knowledge about inappropriate activities at Dublin Castle involving homosexuality meant that he was being protected in order to prevent any scandal being directly attached to the royal family and British aristocracy. Again, none of this is proven. Complicating matters further is the fact that he wasn't in Ireland during the time the theft seems to have occurred, which would mean he had to be working with an accomplice if he was involved. The most popular co-conspirator named for him is Captain Richard Gorges, supposed to be his lover and a man of known low morals who had been caught in what I'm going to call compromising situations with young boys, because YouTube won't like it if I say more than that. He was based in Ireland at the time and could have carried out the theft, helped by being dressed in military uniform and so arousing less suspicion around the castle at night than someone in civilian clothes might have done. For inexplicable reasons, though, John Keane felt that Shackleton was absolutely above suspicion. What about other suspects? As far as Pierce Mahoney went, there was, quote, no shadow of suspicion of any kind on him, according to a letter from Lord Aberdeen to the King on the 14th of October 1907, but he lost his job anyway, collateral damage in the scandal. Other suspects included Aberdeen's own son, Lord Haddo, who had apparently previously played a prank on Vicars by removing the safe key from around his neck while Vicars was drunk, taking the jewels out of the safe and either sending them back to Vicars in the post or leaving them on the man's desk in his office to discover the next morning. I've seen different versions of the story in different sources. He was also seen by Mrs. Farrell inside the Bedford Tower early one morning just after Christmas 1906, 6 months before the theft. His presence there at such a time and his ability to gain entry to the building were highly unusual and never explained. He was in Scotland at the time of the theft, but did he have extra keys to the tower and had he lent them to an accomplice? I have to emphasise that there's really no evidence to support this theory, and the theft of the jewels was an embarrassment to Haddo's father, Lord Aberdeen. But if this is something that Keane suspected, it would help to explain why he was pulled off the case so fast to avoid further scandal. It also highlights once again how lax Arthur Vicars was when it came to caring for the keys to the safe, even the one around his neck. The whole episode ruined much of the rest of Vicars' life. He made a fool of himself by acting on the advice of a self-proclaimed clairvoyant who said that the jewels were buried in a churchyard near Clonsilla and went digging around in 2 cemeteries that her fairly vague instructions could have referred to, finding nothing, of course. When the story leaked to the press, he was made a laughingstock. He also fought the insinuation that he had done anything wrong with great vigour, aided by his half-brother Pearse O'Mahony Sr., who even got most of the Knights of the Order of St. Patrick, who weren't members of the royal family, to sign a petition to the king that called for a full public inquiry and to hold off dismissing Vicars until it was concluded. The Lord Lieutenant refused to forward it to Edward VII, though, perhaps guessing, correctly I think, that it would only increase his anger and wouldn't help Vicars hold on to his job. Attempts to get the king to agree to a compromise, which would have allowed Vicars to remain in a new, slightly different post at the castle, away from the affairs of the Order of St. Patrick, failed. The Viceregal Commission I've already mentioned was set up to look into the matter in January 1908, but all it was really there to do was to examine Vicars' conduct as custodian of the jewels. To nobody's surprise, it found that he had been incompetent in that duty. He was officially stripped of his office by the end of the month. Soon after the theft became public knowledge, he had turned on his former friend, Francis Shackleton, and to his dying day he would say that he had been made a scapegoat for Shackleton and the scandal that he might have unleashed on the royal family if he'd been pursued. Vicars withdrew to Kilmorna House in County Kerry in 1912 and married in 1917, despite the rumours that he was gay, and perhaps he was despite the marriage, but equally perhaps he wasn't. He continued to maintain his innocence right up until his tragic death. By the early 1920s, Ireland was on the brink of partition, and as a former representative of the British government, who still unwisely entertained British troops when they were in the area, Vicars was a target for Republicans. A gang of men showed up at Kilmorna on the morning of the 14th of April 1921. They ordered him out onto the lawn and shot him in the head in front of the house as they burnt it down. He was buried in Gloucestershire, and his last will and testament shows his continuing anger at the events which had led to his disgrace 14 years earlier. It said that, "I might have had more to dispose of had it not been for the outrageous way in which I was treated by the Irish government over the loss of the Irish crown jewels in 1907, backed up by the late King Edward VII, who I had always loyally and faithfully served, when I was made a scapegoat to save other departments responsible, and when they shielded the real culprit and thief, Francis R. Shackleton. My whole life and work was ruined by this cruel misfortune and by the wickedly and blackguardly acts of the Irish government. I am unconscious of having done anything wrong, and my very misfortune arose from my being unsuspicious and trusting to a one-time friend and official of my former office." In the final statement I just read out to you, Vicars hit the nail on the head. He was too trusting, both in 1907 and in 1921, thinking that no one would harm him and that they were all as honest as he. Had he been less trusting, he would have ensured that the jewels were better secured, and he wouldn't have continued to live in the south of Ireland in the early 1920s, when rage against the British government was so strong in so many quarters, and in a house which had actually already been raided a year earlier, making the danger to his person blindingly obvious. I don't like to victim blame, the man absolutely did not deserve what he got, but I think there are some occasions when people have to bear at least partial responsibility when they put themselves or willingly keep themselves in clearly dangerous situations. Vicars was perhaps ultimately too nice and trusting for his own good. Shackleton's life took a nosedive after the theft as well. He went bankrupt in 1910 with debts of £85,000 and moved to North Africa to escape his creditors. He was arrested there in 1912 for fraud, sent back to the UK and imprisoned for a year and 3 months with hard labour. In later life he changed his surname to Mellor, ran an antique shop with his sister and eventually died in 1941 in Chichester. He never admitted to having had anything to do with the theft of the Irish crown jewels. As for Pearse Mahony, he died from a gunshot wound to the chest, which makes a sad irony of his middle name, under suspicious circumstances near his home in County Kerry in 1914. Bennett Goldney died after a car crash in 1918. Richard Gorges later killed a police officer in 1915 who was trying to serve a warrant on him and went to prison until 1925. He apparently died in 1944 after falling under a train on the London Underground. No one knew if it was an accident or not, though I did see another unreferenced story that he lived until the 1950s. But what of the jewels? Well, in 1976, an intriguing memorandum dated 1927 was released by the Irish government, which said that The President, that's President William Cosgrave of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State, would not like them to be used as a means of reviving the order, which fell into abeyance upon the partition of Ireland with the last knight dying in 1974, or to pass into any hands other than those of the state. He understands that the castle jewels are for sale and that they could be got for £2,000 or £3,000. He would be prepared to recommend their purchase for the same reason. Now, this is pretty wild because it insinuates that the jewels were still in existence 20 years after their theft and presumably in a recognisable condition. I read this story in Peter Galloway's book about the Order of St. Patrick, which is linked below and which was one of the secondary sources for this video, which goes on to state that there was a rumour in the 1980s that the jewels had been acquired by the Irish government. However, this rumour was soundly refuted by one Mr. H. Montgomery Hyde in a public letter to the Daily Telegraph newspaper, which said that upon receiving the offer of a sale from a Parisian jeweller, the Irish government refused the jewels as they were a reminder of British rule. Now, I have to say that I find this whole story pretty hard to swallow. I think the jewels were most likely broken up and sold for parts soon after the robbery, being too recognisable in their original form, and if someone was trying to sell them to the Irish government 20 years down the line, I very much doubt that those were the original jewels, or that a Parisian jeweller would be willing to admit to handling stolen property to a foreign government, or offer to sell them at such a knockdown price, when the break-up value of the stones would likely have been higher than that. Perhaps you're not as cynical as me, though, and believe that this is a possibility. I can tell you that the jewels have never surfaced publicly again since 1907, nor do I think they ever will. The only thing which did resurface, weirdly, was the mahogany box in which they had been kept, which was anonymously mailed to the Office of Arms in 1928, by then housed in the National Library of Ireland. I'm not sure if this is different to the, quote, cases which had contained the jewels, collars and badge, which were mentioned in the 1908 Viceregal Inquiry as having been left behind in the safe, or if it's the same case and it went missing after the theft was discovered and was then returned. Whatever the answer, today it remains in the National Library, still bearing the faint impression in its blue velvet interior of the jewels it once held. So what do I think happened in the summer of 1907? Well, I definitely think it looks like the thief or thieves either worked at the castle or had inside help. Shackleton is the most likely suspect, but there was never more than circumstantial evidence, certainly not enough to charge him, and of course he always denied involvement. I don't think Vicars had anything to do with the theft which ruined his life, but I do think he was careless in his duty to protect the jewels, and I'm not surprised that he was fired from his job. Really, I'm just a little taken aback that he thought that that was such an unreasonable move. What did he think would happen when items of such value were stolen on his watch? The exact sequence of events around the jewels theft will never be known, nor do I think they are still out there today in the form they were seen in 1907. The stories that they were for sale in Paris in 1927 seem incredible to me, and as I've said, I do tend to think that that scenario is unlikely, but I concede that it can't be ruled out. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the great scandals and unsolved mysteries of 20th century Irish history. If you have Irish ancestry and would like to learn more about it from the comfort of your own home, I recommend you pick up a copy of my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors, online, available from Amazon as an ebook or paperback and linked below for you. If you join my free mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, you will also get 2 complimentary downloads, including one all about interviewing family members about your family tree. Finally, thank you to those of you who support the channel using the thanks button underneath videos, as this is much appreciated and helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. Let me know in the comments what you think happened to the jewels, and to learn more about other famous jewels, see my videos on the epic adventures of the Scottish Crown Jewels or the theft of the Louvre items. For more on Irish history, see my Irish history playlist. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.